The little girl was forced into harsh chores by her stepmother and constantly suffering physical and emotional misuse. The stepmother was openly gloating over the cruel treatment until the millionaire father came home unexpectedly, witnessed the entire scene, and then did something totally out of left field that silenced everyone. Wishing you a great day, and I'm so glad you clicked on our video. Enjoy the story, stay safe, and be happy. The melancholic sound of a piano drifted through the white mansion. Each key touched the cold air, making the spacious room feel even more desolate. Pale morning light filtered through thick curtains, settling on the long dining table where only 3 people sat, yet the distance between them felt like an entire ballroom. Thomas Warren adjusted his cufflink, glancing at his watch. He looked impeccable. A crisp suit, a perfectly aligned tie, the demeanor of a man accustomed to controlling everything except perhaps his own emotions. He briefly looked over at his daughter. Lucy sat quietly, her tiny hands folded in her lap. She had woken up early just to share breakfast with her dad. "Eat up, Lucy," Thomas said softly without lifting his head from the newspaper. "Yes, Dad," she replied in a whisper, taking a bite of bread that tasted like nothing. Her eyes kept drifting towards her father, as if waiting for something more. Evelyn descended the staircase, her heels clicking softly on the hardwood floor. Wavy blonde hair, a silky blue dress, and a calculated smile. "Leaving so early again, Thomas. Do you have a big meeting today?" "Yep. At the company office." He folded the newspaper, standing up. "I'll be back tonight." She tilted her head slightly, wrapping her arms around him, a routine gesture performed for an audience. "I'll prepare dinner." Then her gaze landed on Lucy. "And the kiddo will help me, won't you, Lucy?" Lucy barely nodded. Evelyn smiled, but the hand she placed on the girl's shoulder tightened slightly, just enough for Lucy to flinch. Thomas didn't notice. He was busy checking his phone number schedules, things he could keep under wraps. In the corner of the room, Victor, Evelyn's younger brother, was polishing a glass. The large man wearing a wrinkled shirt had a lazy look and a prying stare. "Brother-in-law is always traveling. Evelyn must be lonely," he quipped, half joking. Evelyn glared at him. "Get back to work, Victor. Don't talk nonsense in front of the child." Thomas offered a weak smile. "I'm counting on you to keep an eye on the house and support Evelyn. Everything okay?" "Totally fine," Victor replied, a fleeting smirk on his face as his eyes remained fixed on Lucy. Thomas set down his coffee cup and picked up his briefcase. "I trust you to take good care of her." He bent down and kissed the top of his daughter's head. Lucy wanted to say something, her lips trembling, but she only managed, "Be safe, Dad." He nodded lightly and headed for the door. Evelyn walked him out while Lucy stood in the hall, clutching the hem of her dress, trying to hold back tears. When the engine noise faded, the house fell into a heavy silence. Evelyn turned back, the smile instantly gone. "Take that glass to the kitchen and scrub the floor again. It's filthy." Lucy rushed into the kitchen, her hands shaking as she turned on the faucet. Victor walked by, whistling softly, then leaned close to her ear. "Hurry it up, Aunt Evelyn doesn't like waiting." I'm doing it. Do I have to spell it out for you?" He snatched the cleaning cloth and tossed it to the ground. "Clean the floor now." Lucy knelt, grabbing the rag, scrubbing each tile. Cold water seeped through her hands and her knees burned against the rough floor. Evelyn stood leaning against the doorframe, watching. "Faster, Lucy. You go to an international school, yet you clean slower than molasses. I'm sorry. Sorry doesn't clean the floor. Scrub that spot again." Evelyn pointed, her voice icy. "Do you think this is a free vacation spot?" Lucy bowed her head, tears mixing with the mop water. On the wall, their wedding photo hung, a long crack running across it, right over the little girl's face. Outside in the garden, Martha, the elderly housekeeper who had worked there before Evelyn arrived, was picking flowers. From the window, she saw Lucy scrubbing the floor on her hands and knees, the old woman's face crumpled. "Poor little thing," she whispered. At lunchtime, Evelyn called out, "Lucy, bring me my milk." Lucy carefully carried the glass, walking slowly across the living room. But her foot caught on the rug, the milk spilled everywhere, and the glass shattered with a loud crash. She froze solid. "I'm so sorry," the girl whispered. Evelyn sprang up, her face completely void of warmth. "Sorry you just ruined my expensive shag carpet." Lucy stepped back, her foot landing on a piece of broken ceramic, causing her to cry out in pain. Evelyn stepped forward, grabbing the girl's shoulder fiercely, making her almost fall. "Do you have any idea how much this costs? I didn't mean to." Victor stood nearby, arms crossed, smirking. "She's just a kid, sis. Give her a good dressing down so she remembers." Evelyn turned to him. "Shut it." Then she looked at Lucy, tightly grasping the child's small wrist, her voice choked with rage. "I am sick and tired of you, Lucy." The girl struggled to break free, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I'm sorry. I'll clean it up. I promise." Evelyn let go, shoving Lucy hard enough for her to tumble onto the floor. The sound echoed through the room. Martha, still outside, heard the commotion, dropped her flower basket, and rushed to the window, witnessing the scene. "Oh, dear God!" She clenched her fists but didn't dare knock. Inside, Evelyn took a deep breath, turning away as if having vented her fury. "Clean this mess, then go to your room. No lunch for you." Lucy struggled to her feet, her hands trembling as she picked up the pieces of ceramic. Blood stained her fingertips. She winced in pain, then wiped her tears, scrubbing the floor with the cloth now dark with spilled milk. Victor still stood there, leaning against the wall, his eyes vacant. "You do what she says, got it?" Lucy didn't answer. She just bowed her head and kept cleaning. On the wall, the clock chimed 12 times. Each chime felt like a knife slicing through the silence. Evelyn sat on the sofa, sipping tea, turning on the TV, acting as if nothing had happened. Far away, the road leading out of the estate was still hazy with mist. A black car slowed down at the bend, then stopped completely. Thomas looked into the rearview mirror. His face was strained, his eyes paused on a photo of his daughter kept in his wallet. He pulled out his phone, intending to call home. But then a sound came through the car speakers, a noise he didn't recognize, the sound of something dropping. And a cry. He frowned, gripping the steering wheel, turning the car around and accelerating back down the road. In the mansion, Evelyn threw the cleaning cloth onto the floor and stood up while Lucy was still on her knees. The front door burst open violently and wind rushed into the hall. Thomas stepped in, not even bothering to take off his coat, instantly hearing the fading sobs from the living room. He looked around, his eyes landing on the shattered mess and the tiny hands clutching an injury. The space suddenly froze, broken only by the ragged breathing of a father caught between fear and fury. Thomas rushed into the living room, breathing heavily. The smell of spilled milk and broken ceramic mixed, filling the cold air with a strange odor. He stopped short when he saw Lucy sitting on the floor, her small hands clasped together, tears streaming down her face. Evelyn stood beside her, grasping the edge of the table, her face quickly shifting from shock to a look of feigned panic. "You're home early." She slipped and fell. "I was just about to clean the floor when Lucy." Thomas cut in, kneeling down. "What happened to your hand?" He gently turned her palm, seeing the raw, red cut. "Are you hurt?" Lucy ducked her head, trembling, her lips moving. I broke the glass, Dad. I'm sorry." "It's okay, I'm not mad." He tore a piece of the cleaning cloth and wrapped it around her hand. "Just be more careful next time, sweetie." Evelyn stepped closer, leaning in, her voice hushed. "I told you, she's so clumsy. She might be sleepwalking again. I saw her wandering in the hallway last night." Thomas looked up. "Sleepwalking?" "Yes. I was planning to take her to a doctor tomorrow. Lately she's been dropping things a lot. Maybe it's a psychological issue," Evelyn said, tidying up the broken pieces while avoiding his gaze. In the corner, Victor leaned against the wall, a sneer playing on his lips. "Kid's right. They break everything. Don't worry about it, Thomas." Lucy flinched, instinctively hiding behind her father. Thomas clearly saw the fear flash in his daughter's eyes, a peculiar look that caused a sharp ache in his chest. But before he could ask, Evelyn interjected, "You're going to be late for your meeting. Let me take care of the girl." "Seriously, you can rest assured." Thomas hesitated for a few seconds, then stood up. "All right, I'll be back soon." He turned to Martha, the housekeeper, standing outside the doorframe. "Keep an eye on her for me, please." She nodded. "Yes, sir." Thomas's car engine roared to life and drove away. Through the window, Lucy watched him go, her lips tightly pressed together. When the engine noise vanished, Evelyn turned back and locked the front door. The house was dead silent, broken only by the wind whistling through the cracks. "Finish cleaning up, then go to your room." Evelyn's voice was cold. Lucy quietly obeyed, her head bowed low. In the kitchen, Victor sat with his feet up listening to a small radio. "You were good back there, sis. He bought it. Keep your mouth shut. If you screw this up, I won't let it slide." Evelyn replied, her gaze lingering on the safe in Thomas's office, her smile as thin as a razor. "I need to figure out how to get the key tonight." As the afternoon wore on, Martha seized the opportunity while Evelyn and Victor were out sneaking into Lucy's room with a small piece of cake. "Eat this, dear. Don't starve yourself." Lucy looked at her, her eyes bloodshot. "Martha, I want to see my dad. I'll talk to him. Just hold on a little longer." She held the girl's hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. The sound of the door opening startled them both. Evelyn stood in the doorway, her eyes ice cold. "What are you doing in the child's room? Get out. And take all your things with you." "Ma'am? I've worked here for 10 years, not anymore." Evelyn's voice didn't change. "What are you waiting for?" Martha fell silent, looking at Lucy one last time, then quietly walked out. The door closed, severing the girl's last connection to safety. In the following days, the mansion became even more oppressive. Lucy was forbidden from going into the garden. She ate alone in her room, the meals always cold. Victor wandered around while Evelyn grew increasingly restless. One night, Lucy woke up to the sound of arguing downstairs. She crept out into the hallway, slightly opening the living room door. Evelyn was speaking, her voice sharp. "Don't you get it? If Thomas doesn't sign the transfer, we get zilch. How are you going to pay off your debt?" Victor waved his hand dismissively. "I can't sign his papers." "You're his wife. Do something." Evelyn threw a piece of paper onto the table. "I'll find a way. Just need the safe key." Lucy covered her mouth, her heart pounding. She backed away, almost dropping her small doll. Victor heard the sound and instantly turned his head. "Who's there?" She bolted back to her room, scrambling into the closet, hugging her teddy bear, trembling uncontrollably. Footsteps approached and stopped right outside her door, but didn't enter. A moment later, everything was quiet again. The next morning, Evelyn feigned illness lying on the sofa. "Honey, I'm so dizzy. Maybe you should postpone your business trip." Thomas sat beside her, placing a hand on her forehead. "You don't have a fever. I'm just tired maybe from worrying about Lucy these past few days." Evelyn looked at him, her voice lowered. "Just stay home today." Thomas looked around the room, noticing his folders had been disturbed. "Who is in my office?" Evelyn paused briefly. "Probably Victor. He was just cleaning. He shouldn't touch my papers." Thomas spoke slowly, his gaze fixed on the safe in the corner. A small detail struck him. The key wasn't in its proper place. In the afternoon, as Victor walked past, Lucy was wiping the table. Her eyes instantly changed color, her body tensed up. Thomas, watching from a distance, saw the reaction, a sudden recoil, as if the child was too afraid to even breathe. "Lucy," he called, "come here." She walked slowly, her head down. Thomas was about to ask something, but Evelyn appeared, stepping between them. "Look, she keeps sneaking into the hallway. I'm afraid she'll fall." Thomas remained silent, his mind racing. That evening, he went out into the yard and called Daniel. "I need you to discreetly check inside the house. I'm not sure, but something feels off. I'll be there. Keep quiet." Late that night, Daniel parked his car on the roadside, cold wind blowing through the window. He set up a small recording device on the dashboard, looking through binoculars towards the mansion. Inside the hallway, light flickered, then went out. At the same time, Lucy sat on her bed, clutching her teddy bear. Footsteps echoed outside her door, slow, heavy, stopping right outside her room. She held her breath, listening to the sound of metal turning in the lock. The door flew open. A rough hand grabbed her wrist, pulling her up. Lucy screamed, but the sound caught in her throat. The hallway light flashed, reflecting off Victor's face, his eyes dull and his smile warped. Outside the gate, Daniel looked up. The lights in the mansion flickered one last time, then went dark. He leaned over, unlocked his car, and reached into his coat pocket where he kept another recording device, ready to document whatever was about to happen. The afternoon dissolved into a damp gray. Rain pattered on the mansion's roof tiles, enveloping the space in a thick gloom. Daniel stopped his car outside the gate, pulling on a long raincoat carrying a cardboard box labeled with a fast delivery logo. The gate opened. Victor barely glanced at him, then turned away, unsuspicious. "Did you order something?" he asked. Daniel offered a faint smile. "For Mrs. Evelyn. Just sign for me." Victor scowled, scribbled his name, and walked off. Daniel quickly stepped into the hall, looking around the room. In just a few brief moments, he placed two small listening devices, one beneath Thomas's office desk, the other in an electrical outlet near the kitchen. Done, he left, as if nothing had happened. At the same time, in the back basement, Lucy was kneeling in the cold, dark storage room. The space smelled strongly of damp mildew, the walls covered in moss with several broken wooden panels stacked up. She held a broom, sweeping the floor in silence, each dry rasp echoing in the quiet. This was where Victor confined her whenever she misbehaved. As she pulled an old piece of fabric from a shelf, a small wooden box fell out. Dust flew up. Lucy carefully opened the lid. Inside were a few faded photos, wedding pictures of her father and another woman with soft black hair and a gentle smile. Beneath them were a few unsent letters, the handwriting, "Shaky Thomas, I know I won't be around much longer. Please take care of our daughter. Don't let her feel alone." Lucy trembled, touching the photo with her finger. Mom. From the depths of her memory, a vague lullaby echoed, warm, soft as an ancient breath. She hugged the box to her chest, crying silently. Upstairs, Evelyn sat in the living room with Victor. The red wine in her hand tilted slightly, leaving a dark streak along the glass. "Tomorrow he's signing the asset transfer papers," Evelyn said, her voice low but urgent. "That investment fund is just a front. Once the money comes through, we split it. I'm tired of waiting." Victor squinted. "And the kid? Keep her quiet for a few more days. You know how. Are you sure about this?" Evelyn pursed her lips. "Did you forget who has the safe key in his car parked a few blocks away?" Daniel listened through his earpiece, writing down every sentence. Every sound was clear down to their breathing. When Evelyn mentioned asset transfer and keeping the kid quiet, he knew he had hit the core of the truth. He immediately sent the first recording to Thomas along with a brief text. "You need to hear this. Right now." That night on his flight back from New York, Thomas opened his phone. The static noise at first made him frown, then the audio from the recording played Evelyn's voice, cold as steel. "Once I have my share of the assets, the kid has to go. I don't need her." He froze. His chest tightened, his hand gripping the phone so hard his knuckles were white. Every image in his mind spun Lucy's terrified eyes, the wound on her hand, and Evelyn's sickeningly sweet false smile. Anger mixed with agonizing pain surged through him. He immediately called the flight attendant. "I need to cancel the connecting flight. Get me off at the nearest stop. Sir, we do it now." Just an hour later, his rented car was speeding through the heavy rain. The clock showed nearly midnight. The sky was so dark the car's headlights seemed swallowed by the night. Meanwhile, at the mansion, Evelyn's phone rang. After listening, her face turned pale. "Thomas is coming back. Daniel must have tipped him off." Victor cursed, slamming his wine glass down. "What now?" she gasped. "Teach the kid a lesson. I don't want her opening her mouth." "A lesson. Put the fear of God into her. Got it. Don't leave any marks." Victor nodded, flashing a twisted smile. "You don't have to tell me twice." Lucy was upstairs, hearing the heavy footsteps below. She put the box back in the cabinet, hugged her teddy bear, and rushed to lock her bedroom door. The bolt was loose, not fitting quite right. She pushed a chair against it, her heart hammering wildly. Outside, the wind howled through the hallway. The light flickered repeatedly. Rain began to beat violently against the window. Victor was approaching. His shadow stretched long on the floor, mixing with the pale light. Lucy backed towards the corner of the room. "Don't come closer. Please, Uncle. Uncle says you be quiet. Nobody can hear you." His voice was raspy. His hand held something heavy, the steel glinting faintly. Lucy shuddered, retreating, tripping over the edge of the bed and falling down. She screamed, the sound swallowed by the thunder. Shut up, Victor stepped towards her, his hand reaching out. The door burst open with a crash of thunder. Thomas slammed the brakes outside the gate, the tires spinning on the wet gravel. He bolted from the seat, running straight into the house. The gate hadn't fully closed. The rain soaked his shirt. He clearly heard the fading little scream echoing from the upper floor, followed by heavy footsteps. Lucy. The stairs were slick with water. He took 3 steps at a time, his heart ready to burst. The lights flickered, the white flash slicing through the darkness. At the end of the hall, Evelyn stood frozen, her face ghostly pale. Evelyn. Where is she? She stammered. You misunderstood. Victor was just... He didn't listen. Thomas shoved past her, grabbing the handle to Lucy's room. Inside, he heard the sound of things dropping and his daughter's choked sobs. The door was locked. He banged hard, then put all his weight into a kick. The door flew open, slamming against the wall. In the pale blue light of a lightning flash, Victor spun around. In his hand was a metal ashtray. His face was contorted with fury. Lucy was curled up in the corner, her eyes wide with terror. Thunder roared deafeningly, the blue light ripping across the hallway, adorned with antique paintings. Thomas lunged forward, shoving Evelyn aside. The bedroom door slammed open. Cold air and the smell of mildew rushed out. Lucy sat huddled on the floor, her hair-damp hands covering her head. In the corner, Victor spun around, his face pale. The metal ashtray dropped from his hand, rolling a few times before stopping, dented and stained with blood. Thomas didn't think. He grabbed Victor by the collar, slamming him hard against the wall. "What did you just do to my daughter?" Victor struggled. "Let go." A punch landed squarely on his face, sending him tumbling to the floor. Evelyn rushed forward, screaming, "Thomas, stop! Are you out of your mind?" Thomas didn't hear her. He turned back and scooped up Lucy. The girl's small hands were trembling, clinging tightly to his coat collar. Her breathing was ragged, tears mixing with the rain leaking through the window. "It's okay, Daddy's here now," Thomas whispered, his voice hoarse. Lightning flashed, illuminating the chaotic room, a ripped pillow, ceramic shards, and a fresh bruise on Lucy's tiny wrist. Evelyn pretended to be faint, clutching her forehead. "He assaulted someone. He's lost control." Thomas held Lucy tighter. "If you ever dare to touch her again, I won't hold back." Victor scrambled to his feet, blood dripping from his nose, laughing harshly. "I was just teaching her a lesson you don't understand," Thomas roared, his voice drowning out the rain. "Shut up outside the gate." Daniel rushed in, yelling as he pushed the door open. "Thomas." He held a utility tool in his hand, his flashlight sweeping across the room. "The police are on their way." Evelyn retreated, her eyes darting around. "He broke into my house. He assaulted my husband. Call the police to arrest him." "Cut it out, Evelyn." Daniel held up his phone. "I recorded your entire conversation with Victor." Evelyn momentarily froze, her face draining of color. "You were spying on me." Daniel stepped closer, his voice cold. "I was watching a child being subjected to violence." Victor growled, throwing a chair towards them before bolting for the door. Thomas reacted, instinctively chasing after him. He slipped on the wet floor, hitting his shoulder against a table, causing a crystal statue to shatter into pieces. "Stop right there," Daniel yelled, but Victor was making a break for the back door. Police sirens wailed in the night. Blue and red lights swept across the damp walls. 3 officers rushed in, intercepting him just before the exit. Victor yelled, but the rain swallowed every sound. Evelyn stood on the staircase, her hands shaking, still trying to maintain a calm tone. "It's all a misunderstanding. I was just trying to discipline the child." An officer looked around the room, taking notes. "Mrs. Evelyn Warren, I advise you to remain silent." Thomas said nothing. He carried Lucy out of the room. Every step felt heavy, weighing down on his own heart. Outside, the rain still poured violently. They walked through the hallway, past the paintings that were once his pride, now only reflecting distorted shadows. Lucy pressed her head against her father's chest, her breath weak. "I'm scared, Dad." "I know." He gently pressed his lips to her hair. "We're leaving this place. Right now." Daniel rushed after them, placing a hand on Thomas's shoulder. "I'll handle the rest. You take your daughter." Thomas nodded, stepping out onto the porch. The wind whipped his face. His shirt was soaked. He didn't look back. Behind them, police lights cast blue and red beams onto the mansion wall, blurred by the rain. Two officers were restraining Victor while Evelyn was being escorted to a patrol car. "Is this the reality?" she whispered, her eyes fixed on the sight of Thomas carrying his daughter away. Daniel handed the audio evidence to the investigative team. "That contains sufficient proof of cruel treatment and fraud conspiracy. Be careful. They'll fight back." An officer nodded, sealing the evidence. As the police cars drove away, the engine noise faded into the rain. Lucy looked out the car window, her eyes blurred by condensation. She saw the mansion hazy behind the downpour, looking like an imprisoned beast silently watching them leave. Thomas tightly held his daughter's small hand, trying to transmit some warmth. But Lucy didn't say anything, only staring outside, her eyes vacant. "I promise no one will hurt you again," he whispered. "We're going far away from here." The girl nodded softly, tears falling again. He pulled her close, hugging her tightly as if afraid to let go forever. Outside, the rain was so dense it obscured everything, leaving only two small figures amid the stormy night. Down the road, Evelyn sat in the patrol car, her head leaning back against the seat. She turned her face, looking through the water-streaked window. Thomas's car slowly disappeared into the mist. Her eyes flashed with a different look, cold, sharp, and deep as an abyss. Her hands were cuffed, but her fingers were clenched, nails digging into her skin. An officer closed the car door, signaling the driver to move. Evelyn closed her eyes, her lips pressed tight. She leaned her head and spoke softly into the empty space, as if talking to someone absent. "Did you hear that he's taking the kid? I need your help to get everything back." The next thunderclap exploded in the sky. The car's headlights shone straight ahead, the white light tearing through the rain curtain. In the darkness behind them, what was once a home was now just a cold shell, eternally echoing the muffled cries buried beneath the Millionaire's roof. The road out of the city stretched out in the rain and dim lights. Thomas gripped the steering wheel, his hands dry, his eyes fixed on the winding road ahead. Lucy sat in the back seat, curled up in a small blanket, hugging her teddy bear. Her eyes were swollen from crying, but had been dry for a long time. Every time the car jolted over a pothole, she flinched as if the thunder from last night still echoed in her ears. "It's okay, honey," Thomas whispered, his voice low. "We're almost there." There was no reply, only small, steady, silent breaths. As the sun peeked over the horizon, mist covered the road leading into the small town by Ashfield Lake. The lake was strangely still, the surface like a dim mirror reflecting the silvery white sky. Thomas stopped the car in front of an old wooden cabin on the edge of the woods. On the porch, an elderly woman with silver hair was watering lavender bushes. Eleanor, a widow who had lived there for over 30 years, smiled gently when she saw them. "Hello, looking for a place to stay?" Thomas nodded. "I need a quiet place for my daughter and me, maybe for a few weeks. The little cabin by the lake. It's old, but it's still sturdy." She wiped her hands on her apron, squinting at Lucy. "Such a pretty girl. But she doesn't smile much, does she?" Lucy nodded slightly, then hid behind her father. Thomas could only reply with a strained smile. They moved into the house before noon. Inside, the scent of pine wood and apple pie lingered. Thomas unpacked the luggage, opening the window to let the light in. Lucy sat on the windowsill, touching the layer of dust on the frame, her gaze lost towards the lake. The first few days in Ashfield passed slowly. Thomas tried to create a normal rhythm for his daughter, making cocoa in the morning, buying vegetables at the market in the afternoon, and reading bedtime stories in the evening. He bought Lucy a new sketchbook, crayons, and white paper, but she just sat at the table staring at the page without drawing anything. "You love to draw," he gently prompted. Lucy lowered her head, whispering, "I'm afraid I'll draw it wrong." Thomas felt a lump in his throat, unsure what to say. He placed a hand on her shoulder, then stepped out onto the porch, looking at the tranquil lake, his mind in turmoil. At night, he often woke up abruptly. Each time he saw his daughter's door slightly ajar, the pale nightlight shining out. Lucy would be sitting by the window, hugging her teddy bear, staring intently outside. "Are you not asleep yet?" She flinched, shaking her head. "Someone is standing out there. I see their shadow." Thomas walked over, looking out the window. Only mist and trees. "There's no one there, Lucy. It's just the fog." But I hear footsteps. He pulled the curtain shut, gently rubbing her back. It's okay. It's safe here. The girl nodded, but her hands still gripped the teddy bear so tightly the stuffing became distorted. A few days later, Daniel called from the city. Things are getting messy, Thomas. Evelyn hired a top-tier lawyer. She's claiming you kidnapped the child and fabricating the cruel treatment story. Thomas remained silent for a long time. She won't give up. Right. And she bought off 2 witnesses, the new housekeeper and the psychologist who diagnosed Lucy. You need hard evidence. Thanks, Daniel. I'll take care of the rest myself. After hanging up, Thomas sat thoughtfully on the porch, watching the low clouds drift over the lake. He knew that truth alone wasn't enough in the world of the wealthy and powerful. Truth needed to be proven with grit and evidence. Eleanor walked by carrying a basket of lavender. Is something troubling you? Thomas offered a faint smile. Just old business that isn't finished. She nodded softly, her eyes kind. Let the wind carry the old things away. Here the wind takes all the sorrow. Just try to believe it. The next day she invited Lucy to the garden to draw flowers. She spread out an old cloth and set out colors, crayons, and paper. Draw, dear. Draw whatever makes you feel light. Lucy hesitated, then drew the first lines. When she finished, Eleanor looked at the picture, 2 figures, one large and one small, standing by the lake under pale sunlight. These 2 look so lonely, she whispered. Lucy just nodded. But they're still holding hands. Thomas walked by, saw the drawing, and felt his heart clench. He didn't say anything, just stood watching for a long time. That afternoon, he started restoring the abandoned garden behind the house. The small plot of land was barren, the grass growing up to his knees. Thomas wanted to build a swing set, just like the one he built with his own father when he was a boy. He called Grant, a neighbor, a retired former police officer, to help. Grant arrived carrying a toolbox. He was a short, silver-bearded man with world-weary eyes. When he heard Thomas's story, he simply nodded. I know some people at the city police department. Let me check the file on that Victor guy. He might be linked to some old cases. Thank you, Thomas said. I just want to protect my daughter. Grant clapped him on the shoulder. A decent father never stands by when his child is afraid. I get it. In the following days, Lucy gradually grew accustomed to Eleanor. Every morning they picked flowers, drew, and ate apple pie together. Every time Eleanor smiled, Lucy would faintly smile back, a small gesture. But for Thomas, it was the first sign of hope. One afternoon, Lucy took bread out to the lake to feed the ducks. The lake water was smooth as glass, reflecting the deepening purple sky. She tossed crumbs, watching the ducks swim towards her. Suddenly, she froze. On the opposite bank, a man in a black coat was standing. He didn't move, just stared intently towards her. Lucy took a step back. Her breathing became shallow. "Dad!" she screamed. Thomas ran out from the yard, his eyes scanning the direction she pointed, but the opposite bank was now empty, only the grass rustling softly. "Who did you see? Someone standing there, watching me?" Thomas squinted. Must have just been a hiker. But a feeling of unease settled in his gut. He looked around. The trail leading into the woods had fresh tire tracks. That night he sat reviewing the security camera footage from the front porch. The screen was black. He frowned, opening the cover to check. The wire had been cleanly cut, professionally done. Outside, the wind howled fiercely, making the window pane rattle. He turned on his flashlight, stepping out onto the porch. Rain began to fall sparsely. From a distance, car headlights flashed, shining directly towards the house. Thomas stood still, his heart pounding. The headlights turned off without a sound. He walked a few more steps into the yard, sweeping the flashlight around the fence. No one. He went back inside, locking the door more securely, checking the windows in every room. Lucy was asleep, her small face damp with sweat. He tucked her in, then looked out the window one last time. Outside, the dense mist covered Ashfield Lake. But in the midst of the fog, he caught a glimpse of movement, slow, blurry, a fleeting shadow of a person walking past. He held his breath, clutching the flashlight tightly. The faint light shone in that direction, but only revealed the fog dissolving into patches. He wasn't sure if he'd imagined it. The wind blew harder, making the porch door creak. Thomas remained standing, his eyes fixed on the pale white woods. A dry leaf blew past, touching his foot. He bent down to pick it up. It was a small piece of torn paper, the handwritten words streaked with water. "You can't keep her forever." Thomas stared at the message, his heart squeezed tight. He spun around, shining the flashlight towards the woods. A blurry figure moved through the mist slowly but distinctly. He walked quickly down the steps, the flashlight beam trembling in his hand. The wind howled through the trees, carrying damp, chilling air. "Who is there? Show yourself." No reply, only the fog rolling in, obscuring the figure. He stood still, his hand clenched around the flashlight, his chest heaving with ragged breaths. In the distance, the lake rippled, reflecting the faint light from the wooden cabin. From inside the room, Lucy stirred, calling out softly in her sleep, "Dad." Thomas turned back, rushing onto the porch. He stopped at the door, glancing back one last time. Amidst the fog, the figure still seemed to be standing there, neither advancing nor retreating, just watching the house where the father and daughter were hiding. Early morning, the fog was still thick around Ashfield Lake. Thin sunlight streamed through the trees, but the cold lingered on the wooden doorknob. Thomas opened the door and stepped out, seeing Daniel's old car parked by the gate. He got out, his face serious, his coat still damp with night mist. "Evelyn and Victor are out on bail," Daniel said without preamble. "The court accepted the bond and she just hired Harvey as her lead counsel." Thomas froze. Harvey. The same man who ran the investment fund with me in Boston, yes. Now he's on her side. They have the same objective, to get you stripped of custody and ruin your reputation. Thomas remained silent for a long time. The image of Harvey flashed in his mind, his former partner who once smiled while shaking hands, yet secretly pulled the rug out from under his biggest career investment. Now that betrayal had returned, this time in legal form. "She knows how to pick allies," Thomas said softly, his eyes darkening. "Harvey never passes up a chance for revenge." Daniel placed a file folder on the table. "That's not all. Victor was also spotted in this town a few weeks ago. Grant just reported back." Thomas looked up. "Is he sure?" Daniel nodded. "Someone recognized him at a gas station west of the woods. He hired a local and amateur photographer who seems to be casing your place." Thomas looked out the window, seeing Lucy sitting with Eleanor in the backyard. The girl offered a small smile as Eleanor taught her how to prune lavender, but she occasionally glanced towards the woods where the tree shadows lay dark. "She seems very afraid of the dark," Daniel observed. Thomas nodded gently. "Every time it gets dark, she checks the lock 3 times. I know she hasn't escaped that fear yet." "You need to be careful. Evelyn won't stop until you break." That afternoon, Eleanor came over holding a sealed envelope. "Thomas, this was in your mailbox this morning. No return address." Thomas opened it, and his heart sank. Inside was a stack of photos, Lucy feeding ducks by the lake, shot from a distance with a telephoto lens. One was zoomed in so closely you could see the bow in her hair. Eleanor turned pale. "My goodness, who would do this?" Thomas tightly gripped the photos, a spark of rage igniting in his eyes. "Someone is stalking my daughter." He called Daniel immediately. "He's back. I want to know who it is and why. Don't do anything reckless." "Let me come to you," Daniel said. "Tonight we set a trap." That evening, Grant brought over old equipment from his police days, an infrared camera, motion sensors, and small alarms. The 3 of them installed them around the backyard fence and the path leading into the woods. "Consider this a reverse hunt." Grant smiled faintly. "But the prey is someone who messes with kids." Night fell quickly. The wind from the lake carried dampness and the smell of mud. Thomas sat in the living room, the lamp's yellow light cast upon his strained face. Lucy was asleep. Eleanor sat beside her, softly reading a prayer. Late at night, the chirping of insects was steady. Then, click, click, the sensor alarm sounded softly. Thomas jumped up, grabbing his flashlight. Daniel and Grant rushed out right behind him. The 3 of them dashed across the yard, their lights sweeping into the woods. Rain-wet branches brushed against their coats. The fog was so thick their breath blurred the air. A flash of light reflected ahead. Thomas stopped, his heart pounding. Beneath a tree, a figure was kneeling, holding a camera, The lens pointed toward the wooden cabin. Thomas advanced his voice low. "Who gave you permission to photograph my daughter?" The person startled, trying to run, but Grant blocked the way. Daniel shined his flashlight directly into the man's face. The light revealed he was young, wearing a black coat with a press pass around his neck. I was just doing my job," he stammered. "What job?" Thomas roared. "Taking pictures, gathering evidence. Harvey hired me. He said he needed material to prove Lucy was being confined by her father in an environment that causes psychological distress. I don't know anything else, I swear." Harvey Daniel stepped closer. "What about Evelyn?" The man lowered his head, avoiding their gaze. "I don't know much. I only heard them say they wanted to spread the word that Thomas was mentally unstable, that he fabricated the cruel treatment story to gain assets. They told me to observe and take pictures to prove it." Thomas stood motionless, a light rain starting to fall. He felt a fire ignite inside him, not just anger, but the shame of being utterly slandered. "Do you know what this child has been through?" Thomas clenched his fist, but Grant gently pulled him back. "That's enough. Let me handle this." He turned to the reporter. "You're going to give us all the data on your camera, then leave here before I call the police. Understood?" "Understood. Understood." The man nodded nervously, handed the memory card to Daniel, then scrambled away into the woods, his shadow blending into the fog. Grant sighed. "We should check it right now." They returned to the house. Daniel plugged the memory card into his laptop. The screen lit up dozens of photos of Lucy taken from various angles, some even showing Thomas fixing the swing set or standing guard outside the house. There were a few audio files, Harvey's voice clearly audible. "Just make the public believe he's delusional. When it gets to court, everything will be easier." The air in the room was heavy. Thomas sat down, running a hand over his face. "They don't just want the money. They want my reputation and my daughter's future." Daniel nodded softly. "We have the evidence, but we need to plan the next move." Grant lit a cigarette, looking out the window. If Victor is still around, he's not just sending observers. He might try something worse. Thomas clenched his fists. "I won't let that happen." The next morning brought rare sunshine. Thomas sat at his desk, sorting through all the evidence with Daniel photos, recordings, memory cards, bank statements. He began calling old legal contacts, searching for independent counsel. Lucy woke up, walked over holding a newly drawn picture. "Look, Dad." The drawing depicted a bare tree, but a small green shoot was growing from the base. On a branch, 2 small birds were looking towards the sun. "The tree is regrowing after the storm," she said, her voice tiny. Thomas looked at the drawing for a long time, then offered a faint smile. "You're teaching me," you know that Lucy looked up, puzzled. "Teaching you what? Teaching me how to believe that everything can start over." The girl offered a weak smile, then ran out to the garden with Eleanor. The phone on the desk vibrated. Thomas glanced at the screen. Evelyn. His throat felt dry. Daniel looked at him, signaling him to stay calm. Thomas hesitated for a few seconds, then picked up. "What do you want?" Silence on the other end for a moment. Then Evelyn's voice came through, cold and sharp as a knife blade. "Did you think you could hide forever, Thomas? I just sent the summons. This time you and the kid won't have a way out." The call ended. The screen went dark. Thomas put the phone down, his eyes hardening. Outside, the wind from Ashfield Lake picked up, scattering the lavender branches in the garden. He stood up, walked to the door, looking towards the deep woods where the silent war had just officially begun. On a morning at the beginning of the month, the city's central courthouse buzzed with noise. Reporters jostled outside the gates, camera flashes popping relentlessly. News headlines screamed, "Millionaire Thomas Warren, abusive father or man seeking justice." Thomas stepped out of the car in a gray suit, dark circles under his eyes from sleepless nights. Lucy gripped his hand, her small frame lost in the sea of people. Eleanor followed behind, holding an umbrella, her eyes worried. Daniel wore sunglasses, keeping his distance, simultaneously observing the reporters and filming, capturing every scrutinizing face. On the other side, Evelyn emerged from her car in a pristine white coat, her face expertly made up. She smiled scornfully when she saw Thomas. Beside her, Harvey adjusted his tie, wearing a triumphant grin. "We just need to make the public believe he's crazy," he murmured just loud enough for Evelyn to hear. The courtroom was large, with long wooden benches and cold, bright lights. When the judge entered, the noise subsided. The gavel struck a dry, sharp sound. The trial regarding the custody dispute between Mr. Thomas Warren and Mrs. Evelyn Warren is officially underway. Evelyn sat upright, her face innocent, her eyes sparkling. She bowed her head to the judge as if she were the victim. Harvey stood up, his voice smooth. "Your Honor, my client is a woman who has been slandered and publicly humiliated in the media. She loves her stepdaughter as her own. We will prove that these accusations of cruel treatment are fabricated." Opposite him, Thomas's lawyer opened his file. "We have clear evidence that the child was mistreated and that this father rescued his daughter from both physical and psychological harm." Thomas sat silently, his eyes only on Lucy. The girl sat in the ancillary witness seating, her hands clasped her small shoulders, trembling slightly. Eleanor gently touched her shoulder, whispering, "You are not alone." Harvey called the first witness, a young maid Evelyn hired after the incident. The woman timidly stepped up, claiming Lucy often screamed in the middle of the night, knocked things over, and injured herself. "Do you have evidence?" Thomas's lawyer asked. "No, but I heard it," she replied, glancing quickly towards Harvey. The second was a psychologist, a gray-haired man in glasses who testified that Lucy had a tendency towards hallucinations, imagining scenes of mistreatment. Behind them, Daniel leaned in, whispering to Thomas, "That's Harvey's friend. I saw him at his old club." When Thomas's lawyer countered, asking about the actual medical records, the psychologist stammered, I only relied on the mother's account." A murmur spread through the room. Evelyn remained still, only placing a hand lightly on her chest as if heartbroken. It was Lucy's turn to speak. She stood up, her big eyes looking around, her lips pressed tight. The entire room held its breath. "Lucy," the judge said softly, "do you wish to say anything about this matter?" The girl lowered her head. Her voice was small as a breath. "Want to be with Dad?" The statement, shaky yet profoundly true, caused the crowded room to fall into absolute silence. Evelyn closed her eyes, then burst into uncontrollable sobs. "I love her too. I would never hurt her." Thomas closed his eyes. Tears threatened to fall, but he held them back. During the lunch break, Lucy sat alone in the hallway. Sunlight streamed through the window pane onto the tiled floor, reflecting on her face. Eleanor approached, holding a small apple pastry. "Eat this, dear. Then tell me how you feel today." Lucy didn't answer, only wept. Eleanor sat beside her, gently wrapping an arm around her. "It's all right. Just tell the truth. You don't need to be afraid of anyone." In a distant corner, Thomas leaned against the wall, hearing Harvey's laughter as he walked past. "You're going to lose everything, Thomas. The company and that little girl." Daniel approached, whispering, "Let me handle this." He followed Harvey out to the parking lot. Through the window crack, he saw Harvey meeting a man, the same maid witness from earlier, and handing him a thick envelope. Daniel quietly turned on his camera, recording the entire exchange. In the afternoon, the trial resumed. Harvey gave a smooth speech about the love of a mother and the psychological instability of an obsessive father. Evelyn occasionally shed tears, clutching Harvey's sleeve like a tragic victim. When it was Thomas's lawyer's turn to present his case, he stood up, plugging a USB drive into the projector. The large screen lit up in the courtroom. It was the audio recording from the rainy night. Lucy's voice echoed in sobs. "Please stop. I can't take it anymore." The sound of shattering objects, the rain. Thomas's frantic cries looking for his daughter all resonated. The air seemed to freeze. A female reporter in the back row covered her mouth. The judge signaled for the sound to be turned off, but his face had tightened. "Mrs. Evelyn, how do you explain this segment?" Evelyn trembled slightly, forcing a smile. "It must be someone edited it. I don't recall this event. And what about the bruises on little Lucy's wrist?" the lawyer pressed. "She caused them herself." "I saw her hit the wall once." A ripple of protest spread through the audience. Daniel stood up, holding his phone. "Your Honor, we have video footage proving the defense witness accepted payment from Mr. Harvey. This is the video recorded in the parking lot this afternoon." Harvey's face turned white. "Slander? It's fabricated. Fabricated. Daniel smiled faintly. Would you like me to invite digital forensics to verify the video's timeline? Evelyn gripped the seat arms tightly. Thomas looked towards his daughter, seeing her trembling, but her eyes slowly brightening. Thomas's lawyer presented further evidence photos of the injuries, Lucy's personal diary scribbled pages, but with clear words. Today my stepmom made me kneel in the room. I was scared, but Dad doesn't know. I just want Dad to come home. The rustle of reporters' notes filled the air. Evelyn sat frozen. Harvey clenched his fists, sweat beading on his forehead. At the end of the session, the judge struck the gavel, his voice solemn. The court will adjourn to deliberate. The next hearing will take place in 2 days. Chairs scraped back. Harvey turned to Evelyn, his voice strained. If I fall, you're sinking too. Do you understand? Evelyn was silent, her eyes showing panic. She knew he wasn't making empty threats. That evening in the closed room of a hotel, Harvey slammed his hand hard on the table, knocking over a glass of water. Idiot. You ruined everything, Evelyn replied weakly. I didn't expect him to have video. I thought, shut up. Harvey pulled out his phone, tapped a few times, then tossed it onto the table. Watch this. The screen displayed an old, blurry, shaky video filmed inside the Warren house, a scene of Evelyn grabbing Lucy's hair, yelling, then delivering a hard slap. Lucy's cries rang out small but chillingly clear. Evelyn froze her hand, trembling as she covered her mouth. When did you film this? Night descended upon the city like a thick curtain. In Harvey's high-rise apartment, soft jazz played steadily, but it couldn't mask the strong smell of liquor and smoke lingering in the air. Evelyn sat on the couch, gripping her wine glass so tightly her nails dug into her skin. Harvey stood by the window, his back to her, his voice even but cold. You've caused me to lose everything I built, Evelyn. Did you think you could just walk away without paying the price? Evelyn trembled. You promised to help me. You said you could overturn the case. Help? Harvey gave a harsh laugh, then turned his eyes flashing with something venomous. Help you keep your reputation. You don't have one left to keep. He pulled a stack of papers from his briefcase and placed them on the table. Sign it. Transfer the authorized assets to me. In exchange, I'll help you keep quiet from the press. Otherwise, I release that video. Trust me, it'll be on the morning news. Evelyn stared at the papers, the words cold as steel. Her hand shook violently. Are you blackmailing me? Harvey shrugged. Call it what you want. You choose sign or be devoured. She stared at him for a long moment, tears streaming down her face, then picked up the pen. When the ink marked the last page, Harvey offered a faint smile. Good girl. Now both you and Victor are useless to me. The statement was like a final stab. Evelyn looked up, her voice choked. You're just as filthy as I am, Harvey. The difference, he replied, his voice even as a paper cutter, is that I know what I'm doing. At the same time, in the city police chief's office, Daniel submitted a thick file and a hard drive containing the video and audio recordings. He spoke slowly, every word clear. This is proof that Harvey Collins' counsel for Evelyn Warren bribed witnesses and fabricated testimony. The police chief glanced at the file, then turned to his subordinate. Issue an arrest warrant immediately. The news spread like wildfire. When the police raided the apartment, Harvey was pouring more wine. The door burst open, flashlights aimed directly at his face. Harvey Collins. You are under arrest for bribery and fabrication of evidence. He didn't have time to react. The glass slipped from his hand, shattering on the floor. Evelyn sat frozen, watching him being handcuffed, muttering to herself, No, this can't be. The next morning, news dominated every television channel. Large headlines read, Prominent attorney Harvey Collins arrested, scandal in Warren case. The media erupted. The image of Harvey being escorted through the crowd of reporters became a symbol of the collapse of false power. In Evelyn's mansion, she threw the remote control at the wall. The sound of glass breaking echoed loudly. Her breathing was ragged, her hair disheveled, her face pale. He betrayed me. He betrayed me. Victor, her former accomplice brother, stood hidden behind the door, his eyes terrified. "Sis, what are we going to do now?" Evelyn looked at him, laughing twistedly. "What are we going to do? You should be asking what they are going to do to us." That night, Victor disappeared, but he didn't get far. Police arrested him at a border checkpoint. Under the neon lights, he confessed almost immediately, his voice trembling. "Evelyn told me to do everything. I just listened. I didn't want to hurt the kid." The police took notes, every word like a nail being hammered down. The following morning, the city newspaper printed a new headline: "The perfect wife is a manipulative abuser." Evelyn's photo was on the front page, a beautiful face, vacant eyes, beneath which were the lines describing her charges. The whole city was abuzz. People talked in cafes, on buses, on street corners. I thought she was sweet, but she was that cruel. In the small house by Ashfield Lake, Thomas held the newspaper in his hand. He wasn't jubilant, nor did he gloat. He just sighed. Lucy sat beside him, looking at her father. "Are you sad?" Thomas smiled faintly, stroking her head. "No, just tired, honey." Eleanor walked in holding a bunch of pale purple lavender. "This flower is a symbol of healing," she said, placing it on the table. Lucy looked at it, then took a small sprig and tucked it into her sketchbook. Daniel arrived soon after, a rare look of relief on his face. "We've practically won. The court will rule this week." Thomas nodded, but his voice was slow. "I just want Lucy to have peace, to no longer be afraid." Outside, the girl was floating paper boats on the lake. The small boats drifted away, the water reflecting the first light of the new morning. Eleanor stood beside Thomas, her voice low. "You know, I once had a daughter. She passed away due to domestic misuse. When I look at Lucy, I see her reflection." Thomas turned, his eyes welling up. "I'm sorry." She shook her head. "No need. It's just, if Lucy smiles again, I feel like my daughter is also finding some peace wherever she is." They were silent for a long time. Only the gentle wind and the scent of lavender lingered in the air. That evening, Thomas went into his office and taped Lucy's drawing, "The Tree Regrows After the Storm," onto the wall. The desk lamp shone down, making the small patch of green stand out in the somber room. He looked at it for a long time, then whispered, "We made it through the storm, didn't we, sweetie?" When he turned off the light and stepped out, the window was slightly ajar. Wind rushed in, blowing the newspaper off the table onto the floor. On the page, the bold headline was clearly visible: "Final Hearing. Tomorrow." Outside on the porch, night quietly enveloped the town. Lucy woke up startled, stepped out, and pulled her sweater tighter. She looked far away through the mist. At the end of the trail car, headlights flickered in the night. A convoy of vehicles slowly drove towards the city, a prison transport van. Lucy stood still, her small hand gripping the railing. She didn't know who was inside, only felt her heart pounding as if the past was truly driving away. In the distance, Ashfield Lake reflected the streak of the car lights, stretching like a silver thread in the darkness. The wind gently rustled the lavender on the porch, releasing a soothing fragrance, signaling a dawn was approaching, but also the start of the final judgment day. That morning, the sky was covered with a thin layer of mist. Crowds gathered outside the central courthouse. Everyone wanted to witness the final verdict in the Warren case. Camera flashes popped like a storm. The buzz of conversation rippled against the cold stone steps. Thomas stepped out of the car, Lucy beside him, wearing a simple white dress. In her hand was her old teddy bear, the only item remaining from the old house. Daniel followed closely, carrying a thick file. Eleanor walked slowly, holding Lucy's hand, her eyes gentle but firm. In the courtroom, cold lights shone down on the wooden benches. Everyone rose when the judge entered. Evelyn was led in through a back door, her hands lightly cuffed, unmade up, her face pale. She looked up, meeting Thomas's eyes, and for the first time there was no pretense, just an exhausted, disoriented woman. The gavel struck. The Warren case verdict hearing is now in session. The prosecutor opened with the video Harvey had recorded. The large screen displayed the image of Evelyn in a fit of rage, grabbing Lucy's hair, the girl's cries echoing throughout the room. Many people covered their mouths. Some reporters lowered their cameras, unwilling to take another picture. At the same time, Victor's statement was read aloud to the court. I just did what my sister told me. I didn't want to hurt anyone. I just thought if we had money she would calm down. Evelyn tightly closed her eyes, 2 tears falling onto the table. When asked to speak, she stood up, her voice hoarse. I used to think controlling others would make me strong. But in reality, I was just afraid of being left behind. I was afraid of poverty, afraid of losing everything. And when I was afraid, I turned into a monster that even I despise. The room was silent. Light from the window streamed in, illuminating her pale face. Lucy sat beside her father, her eyes wide. She was neither timid nor angry. She just watched. When Evelyn bowed her head, Lucy softly whispered, I forgive her. Thomas turned astonished. What did you say? Lucy gripped his hand. I forgive her. She's lost everything already, Dad. No one in the room spoke. Even the judge paused his pen for a moment. A minute of silence stretched on, then the judge spoke, his voice deep and clear. The court has reviewed the testimony and all evidence. Mrs. Evelyn Warren is found guilty of cruel treatment fraud and inciting conspiracy. The sentence 12 years, imprisonment, permanent revocation of custody and inheritance rights. The gavel struck a dry, final sound. Evelyn didn't react, only looked directly at Lucy one last time. In her eyes there was no more scheming, only weakness, almost pleading. As the officers led her away, she turned back, speaking softly, almost inaudibly. I'm sorry. Lucy watched her go, her eyes damp but her lips curving slightly, not a smile but acceptance. Thomas pulled his daughter into his arms. He felt a heaviness in his chest. It was over, but there was no victory here, only the remnants of pain. After the hearing, reporters clustered outside the courthouse, the camera flashes like a storm. Daniel protected the father and daughter as they reached the car. When the car door closed, the noise outside faded, leaving only their breathing and heartbeats. You okay? Daniel asked. Thomas nodded. I think, finally, justice has a human face. Daniel offered a faint smile, pulling a cigarette from his box. He leaned against the third-floor railing of the courthouse, looking down at the crowded street. At least this time we saved someone, he murmured. The light of the cigarette flame flickered on his face, evoking the image of his late wife, also a victim of family conflict. He sighed, letting the wind carry the smoke away. Late afternoon in the small house by the lake, the sunset gilded the wooden wall. Lucy sat by the window watching Eleanor tend to a small lavender pot. You plant it, she said. This flower blooms in the summer, but for that to happen you have to care for it every day. Lucy smiled faintly, digging into the soil with her hand. Like me, right? Yes. Every wound needs time to bloom. Thomas stood nearby, silently watching the 2 women, one old, one young, like 2 pieces of the piece he had once lost. That evening, he hung Lucy's painting, The Tree Regrows, after the storm on the wall, right next to the window overlooking the lake. Moonlight streamed in, reflecting on the water's surface. He whispered, Your mother, she would have wanted to see this scene too. Lucy came close, leaning her head on her father's shoulder. I'm not scared anymore, Dad. Thomas gently squeezed her hand. I know. You're stronger than anyone I've ever met. Outside, the mist gradually dispersed. The sun rose on the horizon, the first light of dawn shining brightly on Ashfield Lake like an endless golden ribbon. On the car window, droplets of water remained, reflecting the light, glittering like unshed tears. Lucy opened the window, and the wind rushed in, blowing an old drawing sheet away. The paper flew low outside, spinning in the air, then gently fell onto the lake's surface. On the paper, the clumsy handwriting of an 8-year-old was clear in the sunlight. Dad and me, where there is light. Thomas stood by the door, watching the paper drift away. The light reflected on his face, making his wrinkles seem to vanish. Somewhere the past seemed to be falling away with that paper, leaving only the dawn and a new beginning for 2 souls who had just been saved. 1 year later, the morning mist over Ashfield Lake was thick and clear like the breath of spring. Amidst the green lawn, the beige house named Safe Haven appeared tranquil, surrounded by the purple lavender garden that Lucy and Eleanor had planted with their own small hands. The wooden gate opened every morning, welcoming children from other shelters to play and learn, carrying excited laughter like young birds finding their nest. Thomas was no longer the busy executive, no more late-night calls or complicated stock charts. He was the center's director, the man who made cocoa every morning, the one who told fairy tales every night. His desk no longer held contracts or figures, only notebooks scribbled with the small dreams of the children. Build another garden area in the back, make a small fish pond by the yard. Buy more watercolors for the art class. Daniel remained close handling security for the center. Every morning he taught the children martial arts, how to stand tall and how not to bow their heads to fear. When the children poured out into the yard, their laughter mixed with the wind, and for the first time in years he truly smiled a smile that no longer hid old pain. Eleanor managed the therapy garden. The pale purple lavender beds bloomed, releasing a soothing fragrance. In the small corner where she often sat, 2 framed photos rested side by side, her lost daughter and Lucy, the girl who made her believe that love could be passed from one person to another, even through scars. Lucy was 9 now, her hair long and bright-faced. She helped teach art to the newly arrived children kids who were once afraid of the dark, once silent like her. Whenever they nervously held a brush, Lucy would sit down and smile. "It's okay, just draw what you see in your heart." On her desk, her old teddy bear still lay there, but now stitched up with purple thread, a sign of resurrection. Every morning, Thomas made cocoa, placing 2 mugs on the old wooden table, then walked with his daughter along the lakeshore. They floated small paper boats, each carrying a piece of paper with the words, "Let go of the old things." Lucy watched the boats drift away, the morning sun sparkling on the water like a memory that had been cleansed. One afternoon, the mail carrier delivered an envelope bearing a prison postmark. It was a letter from Evelyn. She wrote in shaky handwriting saying she had started learning to paint, and her first paintings were of Ashfield Lake and the light from the window. At the end of the letter, she asked for her apology to be passed on to Lucy. Lucy read the letter for a long time, saying nothing. Finally, she folded it, went out to the garden, and placed the paper under a blooming lavender bush. "I'm not angry anymore," she whispered. "I just hope she finds peace too." That spring, the safe haven garden was a vibrant purple. The scent of lavender spread throughout the yard, mingling with the children's laughter and the sound of the wind from the lake. Reporters visited, writing that this was a place where pain turns into light. When asked, Thomas simply smiled. "We don't heal anyone, we just sow seeds and let them grow from there." That evening, Lucy held her first painting session. The picture she chose to hang was a scene of 2 people walking in the rain. In the distance, a house glowed, the yellow light streaming from the window like a promise. There is always a place to come home to. When the session ended, Thomas lifted his daughter, pressing his forehead against her soft hair. "You're truly safe now, aren't you?" Lucy nodded, smiling in the lingering twilight. The imaginary camera slowly pulled back. The beige house appeared amidst the purple lavender field, reflecting on the shimmering gold of Ashfield Lake. Small paper boats floated gently on the water, each carrying a wish for the children who were once forgotten. Thomas stood in the flower garden, hands in his pockets, watching Lucy laugh among the kids.